Welcome back to the Special Ed Strategist podcast, where we bridge learning gaps and empower families to access the special education services they need. I am your host, Wendy Taylor, and I'm thrilled to kick off season 3 with you. Our podcast is your go-to resource for special education, offering expert insights, inspiring stories, and actionable tips to help your child thrive. And this season, we'll dive deeper into the world of special education. So whether you're a parent, educator, or passionate advocate, join us in this journey. To make this season unforgettable, please like, listen, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps us reach more families and create a stronger, more inclusive future. So hit that subscribe button, join our community, and let's make season 3 a game changer. Thanks to listeners like you. Hello and welcome to our show today. I'm excited to talk about a very important topic that I don't think gets enough street credit, and that is transition planning. So I'm going to welcome our guest, Tom, today. I'm going to have him give us some introduction, and then we're going to dive right in. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thanks for the opportunity. I am Tom Liniak, and I'm many things, so we'll go through a few of them. I'm an attorney. I am a proud parent of a son with autism who is now a young adult. And for the last 18 years, I've dedicated all my efforts really to helping people with disabilities realize their potential, first in instructional sports and socialization through a nonprofit that I co-founded. And for the last 15 years, over on the side of disability employment. And I'm honored and proud of the fact that I've been part of close to 900 job placements, which 86% of them were still there after a year, even more important. And, again, a whole group of people that in many ways were doubted, and I was able to empower them to realize their potential. Last but not least, as a parent and as a professional in this field, I began to recognize that adult services and moving from the school system to adulthood for sons and daughters with autism and families was incredibly overwhelming, incredibly daunting. All this information is not in one spot. So a couple of years ago, I started a business called Disability Transition Support, and I offer customized consulting to help people understand, not make mistakes, and maximize the transition to adulthood. And then as you get to adulthood, really maximize outcomes for the rest of your life.
And it's so incredibly important for this conversation today because you kind of in your intro pointed out really two things, right? So we have our transition planning that takes place for our students that have IEPs, and ensuring, or the purpose behind it, to ensure that they are successful in transitioning from the school setting to adult. But I think where we have a lot of questions is, well, first we're going to dive into what does that look like? What does that mean, that transition planning, but the adult services that are available to families, and what does disability employment look like? And so let's just talk about the importance of transition planning first. So what does that look like, and why is that so crucial for their future?
I'm going to answer it backwards. It is so important because, again, the school bus isn't coming anymore. And all the services aren't in one meeting. And we move from an entitlement-based system where you're entitled to a free and appropriate education to a needs-based system. And not all of the supports or aids are found in one spot. So it is, as I say, a bit of a daunting discovery process to understand even what is available, what might apply to your son or daughter. And then start understanding not just the individual pieces, but put them into an overall picture and put them into a timing picture. Because everybody talks about transition from the school system, which is a big one. And, these individuals are going to spend decades out of the school system. And most of them spent, anywhere from 13 to 18 years in the school system. So all of a sudden, what about 36 years, 40 years out of the school system? Time says this is very important. The other thing is these are young people. And just like all of us, they are going to go through more transitions than leaving school. They will become adults. They will have successes. They will have challenges. And the concern of every parent is at some point parents won't be there. So it's fundamentally important to understand and maximize support so that individuals can really be empowered and live as full life as possible.
So then where would a parent start, right? So we're talking about transition planning usually starts kind of as students are in middle school going towards high school. Can you tell us, how would a parent approach that versus once they get out of school to that needs-based approach?
Yeah, I think the first place, of course, is to many times it's just not done, or it's not done, even though, the IEPs and the IEP process talks about, having a transition plan. And, I work with many people who really don't have one and weren't aware that they should have one. And they also don't know what it should look like. So, I help people out a lot with that because, starting early in anything and starting step by step is always going to be the best way. So I think you really want to bring it into that IEP meeting and you want to, insist that that issue is addressed. And, there are a lot of things about transition. One is hopefully building blocks towards employment, but the other is building blocks towards being as independent as possible and prosperous as possible in adult life. And that could be socially, safety-wise, advocacy, whatever it's going to be. So I think early on, requiring that there be a plan, that there are very specific goals, and particularly people who are in certificate programs, talking about where will I be afforded opportunities to begin practicing work tasks, work skills. Because again, this is a learn by doing art. That's how all it works.
And if you think about the crux of our law, right, the whole goal is to help guide students towards that future independence, education, and employment. So what would a solid transition plan look like?
Solid transition plan should begin talking about developing independence, developing advocacy, developing social skills, and then should work towards exposure to actual work and doing actual work hands-on. And I think these are the keys. The other component of it is to understand through your transition teacher, outside agencies, because, for example, Maryland Department of Rehab Services, as of age 14, now that is not the school system, but as of age 14, and typically most people access it around age 16, you could begin doing some preliminary training. It could be hands-on internship training. It could be advocacy training. It could be, and these are things that you can build in addition to what's happening. And the transition teacher should be able to guide you to Maryland Doors to be able to help get that set up. So that's something that, again, would be a good thing to require.
Do all states have an equivalent to like a Maryland version of what it looks like for support in adulthood?
They do. I mean, there are, we talk about a lot of different supports. So the primary supports in Maryland and other states are for those that qualify, Maryland DDA, which is home and community-based services. It could be a combination of services. It could be employment, could be housing, could be assistance in the home or assistance in your own place of living. Could be medical assistance. It really comes under Medicaid. And, the funding for all that harkens back to a time when people were put in institutions. And, decades ago, thank God, it was split out. Now, not everybody qualifies for that. Another one, of course, and this is where we get into there are multiple choices here. Sometimes instead of, sometimes in addition to Maryland Doors, another Maryland program. Well, Maryland Doors is a shorter term program, typically months up to a year, with one primary focus: work training, ultimately work placement, and hopefully work retention. Amidst all of that, there, of course, is also Social Security, which is something that as people turn 18, they should be thinking about applying for, both in terms of financial assistance, but medical insurance assistance as well. And there are all manner of other programs, not the least of which would be housing vouchers, these kind of things. Again, if your income is zero or not very high, you may be able to access a program that basically would allow you to, have some contribution so that you could live in your own place.
What is I mean, I know there's a lot of different programs, right? But what would that qualification tend to look like? I know there's probably a lot of variables that go into that, but what would a qualifying student, what are the parameters?
Yeah, and again, it's somewhat varies program by program. Parameter number one is somebody must have a disability that is going to affect their ability to really prosper, be it in employment or in life. And then you get into kind of the gray area of, who qualifies there, who doesn't. When you go over to the Maryland Doors side, the more help they believe you need, the quicker you will be served. If you're on the DEA side, everybody gets served at the same time if they qualify. But then it's a matter of saying, well, my program might be just employment. Your program might be employment, help in the home. It might be housing as well. And, again, it's a matter of understanding what's there and what the qualifications are for each one. But to start with disability, the more challenge that it creates in all these aspects of life, the more likely you are to get services or a broader array of services.
So what are some practical steps parents can take to start that transition planning for their kiddo and still kind of keeping things stress-free?
Yeah. Well, while keeping it stress-free, that's a tough one, because I lived that one too. And this is, what I've been doing for a living for a long time. So lower stress probably is the more accurate way to put it. I think, really understanding, kind of what you're after. And, as parents, I think a lot of times, whether it's child disability or not, we do things for people, not meaning to, either because we are in a hurry or we're trying to be nice. But, giving individuals tasks in the home, whether it is, double step tasks, taking out the trash, emptying the dishwasher, putting away dishes, these kind of things are very important, because these are the basics and these are the building blocks of work and independence and being on your own. So there's the in the home aspect. The other piece, like I say, is to begin to educate yourself about the individual components and try to understand, what is and is not in terms of qualification, these kind of things. Part of that can be through the school transition teacher. Part of it can be, like most things in life, the good news is it doesn't all need to be done at once. So if you start early, you will feel less stressed. You will feel less overwhelmed. You still may need to end up talking to someone like me, or, to say, I've sat in these things, but they just don't connect. Or how do they connect for my child? The people that come to me typically say, and these are very smart people, but they just don't do this every day. And like I said, because it comes from multiple sources, it's kind of hard to digest. And their main thing is, how do I make sure that I don't make a mistake? And also, how do I make sure that I am, turning over the stones and maximizing that which is legitimately available for my child? So not a bad idea to intersect with someone once. I think immerse first, go early, and understand if your child's 14 or 16 or whatever, and you don't understand everything, it's okay. Start here and then begin to pick up some vocabulary, begin to pick up some general, and then, maybe talking to someone, about painting this picture for yourself, but one bite at a time.
Absolutely. And is part of that, know what you don't know. And that when you're thinking about your kid, when it comes to that future education, employment, and independence, what does that look like for each child is very different. And starting early to start that plan, I always talk about with families in terms of with their parent input statement. Think about where you see your child 6 months from now, a year from now, 3 years, 5 years, so that those conversations can start early and that you have it outlined in that student's IEP so that you can start to connect with the folks like yourself or folks in the school team to ensure that applications are put in and so forth. Would you say that's correct?
Right. Because there's certain milestone times, like Social Security, you can't apply for until you're 18. So You're 14, don't worry about it.
Right.
You know,
Right.
beginning to get some internship early work training, you can begin to access it at age 14. Do you need to necessarily? You don't, but somewhere in that 14 to 16, think about it. It's some steps along the way. And frankly, you can get some of these things out of the way early. So Maryland DDA, you could apply anytime. You do not need to wait till your child is, walking out on the last day of school, and I would not recommend that. Again, if there are some things you can get done early and just be eligible for those services, it's just another thing, to get out of the way.
What are some misconceptions or misunderstandings that parents may have about transition planning?
Sadly, a lot of people think it's very orderly and defined, and it isn't. So that's not good news. And like I say, you truly have to be your own advocate, when it comes to a transition plan. School IEPs are more often focused, and this is where an educational advocate can really be helpful to you, because that transition plan is important and may continue to become even more important than the class that someone is taking next semester. So I think that's thing number one. There are a lot of secondhand anecdotal stories, and what is this whole employment thing? What happens? There's not a parallel universe. If people are going to work, they're going to work as my coworker, your coworker, and they may well get support to do that, support to make sure that they're ready to go there, that they learn, that they stay there. In 15 years in disability employment, everybody comes in, and we have to talk about what the child wants, and we have to talk about, we have to talk about abilities of the child when it comes to the workforce. So my own son, John is a talented guy, but there's a lot of people say, well, I want him to work in an office, okay, which is fine. And then I will say, what skills does he have today that, you believe would be kind of at market level that an employer would pay for? And people will say, well, he can shred paper, and shredding paper is not really a job, per se. So understanding that there is no ceiling. And, my first job was in the stockroom of a shoe store. I'll tell you what, I learned how work works there. I also learned I didn't want to stay there, but at the time it was great. So, try to look at the parallels in your career or another child who doesn't have a disability, and understand that your educational journey has been step by step. And this adult transition in life is going to be step by step as well. And it's okay, because we've got time to get where we want to get. And like I say, just because you hear second or third hand that, well, I have a friend who works for the federal government and he doesn't do anything and he makes X $1,000, since I don't know who you're talking about, I can't comment, but I can tell you generally that doesn't exist, because I've never been able to find an employer who said, I'd like to pay people minimum wage to multiples of minimum wage. And here's the deal. You come, you really don't do anything. You do whatever you want. And if you have skills, fine. If you don't, fine. And we're all happy. So we want to stay grounded. As we stay grounded, that doesn't mean we extinguish possibility. My own son, people said, I'm not sure if he's going to be able to work. Maybe, probably. He can, he does. He's the best at what he does. He's valued. And so it works, but we need to be, it's hard, a little bit patient.
Can we just talk a little bit, you talk about employment and we talk about placement and training and retention. What are our options? What are parents' options for thinking of those things? And when should they start kind of planning that process?
It's going to be kind of individual. There's some commonalities, but it's individual. I've worked with people who have had degrees, multiple degrees, advanced degrees. I've worked with people who have high school certificates, it just depends. So there's a broad range of people. But again, some years ago, and I spent a lot of time working on committees trying to bring this to Maryland, and it worked out. The notion that you can start doing internship, that you can start on-site work training, learning how work works. This is a whole nother social environment. This is not school. And you're not even in a classroom. So it's a big frontier, And, for my son works in a 160,000 square foot facility. And you might think, wow, someone with autism, that's a lot of sensory input. How the heck does that ever work? And it works phenomenally, but it's different than sitting in a classroom in school, and it's far more independent. So we train that, we teach that. These internships for pre-employment training, I think, are key. And they're also, we've worked with a lot of people who have done college, be it Montgomery College, four-year college, master's degree. Some of them found a real home in college. They loved college, and I loved college too. Some don't want to leave college, and that's hard to fund because going to college is not a job ultimately. No one pays you for it. And I think the key is, again, as you're going down your educational pathway, that could be certificate, it could be diploma, it could be college or beyond, mix that with practical experience, because whatever that educational piece, whatever that skill set is, in the long run, we want to use it in a workplace. So I think doing these things in parallel are quite important along the way. And I mean, my other son, again, when he went to college, experiential learning is now part of almost every college curriculum. And I think it's good.
Can you give us some examples of how you have seen pre-employment training work? What would that look like? What could families ask for so that they have a better sense of what is available?
Some of it is classroom, and you really got to think about your child. Does your child learn from words in the air, or staring at the Promethean board or whatever they're going to have? The ones that I think are ultimately either after that or right away even more valuable are the ones that literally put you on site at an employer. And the key and the best providers really are the people that put you in these situations, and they train you to work standard. So you might go to a deli, and I work with a deli in Rockville, and you also have a mail order, well, I guess not mail order, but internet, cookie business, and they ship around the country. And we worked with them on aspects of that. But what we would do is if a paid job there or in another place would be 8 tasks, we first take two or three. And we teach you how to do those to work standard. And we don't worry about speed, because if you can't do it right, we don't speed up.
Right.
Once you get those and you get independent on that, then we talk about maybe another task. Then we talk about, okay, now you have work performance standard. Now we have to move to saying, okay, to get paid at this, instead of doing 10 units per time period, you'd need to move to 15. And, progressively try and move up the case. I wouldn't be too worried. I get asked a lot too. It's like, well, my son loves computers, and everybody wants to go to ZeniMax over here. And they said, I want to be a video game tester, and that's what I want to do. And it's like, well, a lot of people want to do that, especially if they ever got paid to do it. It's like a beta version of a game, and you try and break it, right? But again, this is work. So it's about how are we matching skills to that. And I wouldn't be too worried in the first exposure to this. Again, back to my shoe store example. In the first instance, we're trying to learn a little bit of the environment, the social interaction, and how work works. If you don't have that down, then we can never move to whatever it is you're interested in, move forward. Because when you hire people, they need the skills, but they also need to be able to do it in a workplace independently and deal with other people, be they customers or coworkers or whatever it's going to be. So again, let's take one thing at a time. Work on, kind of how work works. Are you on time? Are you, do you have hygiene? Is your hair combed? You are now representative of the brand of that business. And it matters. And people make decisions in hiring and who moves forward based on things like that. So let's get those out of the way first, add education, add experience, and then we can go, to subject matter second.
And that's, I think, incredibly important for us as parents to think about in terms of that skill building that you explained, right? In terms of hygiene and culture and some of the elements to a workforce that will be crucial for success for our students that are entering the workforce.
Yeah. And I think, look, you're used to being in school.
Yeah.
And somebody else says something in school, you might very quickly respond or say something. and you know, the social interaction in a workplace, hopefully, might be a little different. So you've got to be at times a little more measured. If a supervisor asks you to do a task or to switch, and it's some of your stated tasks, we don't want to, be upset. We don't want to have a meltdown. We don't want to say, oh, I don't want to do that. We've got to move from perhaps the school home piece to understand that we're working in a different social environment, and it's a work social environment, and it can still be fun. And it doesn't mean you can't express your opinion. It just means you might have to do it in a little different way.
Can you give us some insight on, we talked about employment a little bit, and we talked about transitioning to employment and how to do that. How would parents get support for that independent living piece if that is part of their story?
Same process. Again, the supports for helping you understand what's out there, the supports for helping you, move to a living situation outside the home and supporting you typically come under Maryland DDA. So again, you would be applying. In the first instance, you are deemed to be eligible or not eligible for DDA services. Then there's a whole scope of services, from housing to, personal assistance to employment to many other things. If you are eligible, then you want to come into a person-centered plan. And, what does that person want? Well, maybe not today, but they'd like to have a job. They'd like to one day move out of their parents' house. They would like to be able to function in that housing in a way that's safe, in a way that, a lot to learn about having your own place, so that's where in the PCP, we start with the goals of the person. So the PCP being the adult DDA equivalent of the IEP. Everything's got a P in it and everything's got initials, but that's just the way it goes. But understanding that there is a broad array of possibilities that, fit under this umbrella. And we follow that which the person, wants. And then we start measuring to say, well, are they totally independent? That transportation is another one, which is, how is that person going to transport themselves, but for mom and dad giving them a ride? And, having people assist you with that, train you with that, whatever that's going to be. It could be public transportation. There's a myriad of services, from metro access to ride and call to all sorts of point-to-point things, and that really comes into that meeting. And again, understanding and advocating for the broad array of what you're after.
What are kind of the steps for housing? What does that support look like?
Supports for that, the first thing, there's a new under DDA called Housing Support Services. So something under Maryland's new waiver got approved. And what that is meant to do is give you a guide or an advocate just to paint this whole picture. Because what is this universe? What are the possibilities? And that program is only a couple of years old, but it's pretty darned effective in its rollout, especially as a new rollout. To educate people, the second thing it does is looks at different supports or housing credits, housing vouchers that you might be able to qualify for. If you do, basically working with you to apply for all those, because many of those have a wait length. Your number does not come up immediately. And it could be a year, it could be 3 years, this kind of thing. So again, timing of saying no interest today, but it's like, well, is there some interest in a 3-year window? Okay, you should put that in. And then, really talking about what's important for you, the where, the what type, balanced against what do you do? Can you walk out your door and access things and be independent, or do you need a ride everywhere you go? Is it far away from things that you might want to do in your job? So you look at everything else. And then, like I say, within supports, once you're in that housing situation, then, helping to teach you about safety, cooking, cleaning, all manner of things to be safe and prosper.
Is there supported housing for individuals? And if so, what does that look like?
So years ago, it was always a group home model. And, it started when people, moved from institutions. It was the group home, and you had 4 people, 6 people, and with disabilities, they lived in the group home. There are still some group homes, although, federal and state policy and legislation has moved largely away from, the group home model because it really was not all that integrated. And now housing is kind of a broad array, but it looks a lot like, an apartment building that you drive by every day, and being one of the residents of that apartment building, maybe with a roommate, maybe not. In some situations, the other thing is it might be in that complex that there are actually 8 units that have individuals with disabilities. And with the providers and this kind of thing, sometimes you can have really an additional social component because now you're not the only person, in that building, but you've got, some buddies, and they get together maybe once a week or whatever it is to do things that everybody else does too. So
in terms of, you had mentioned personal assistance, what does that look like?
it falls under the category of personal supports, and it really, that is kind of assistance to make sure that, say you like to swim or go to the gym, but you need assistance getting there, and you need assistance, to be able to kind of carry that out effectively. That would be making sure that that social piece gets done because it's important to you in a safe manner. And then all manner of things, within a living unit. So, everything from teaching people to, well, they need food, how to shop, you know, how to cook, how to look at expiration labels, which is an important thing, and do all the things that we all have to do, laundry, vacuum, these kind of things. So part of it's social to carry out non-work activities, and part of it to make sure that things run well and smoothly inside a living arrangement.
So it's called Community Living Experience, CLE, and that allows students to transition. They're taking coursework. They're also learning to live independently. Are there other resources available for families if they're not necessarily in an area where something like CLE is? Or have you heard of other options for students to be able to have that social support, school support, and independent living support kind of under one roof?
Yeah, it is. If you come into the DDA system, then yes, you can build it off the DDA system. If you're not in the DDA system, then it really, comes back to kind of a private pay model where you would have to be bringing in, your own resources to do that. When you go to various colleges, some are quite prolific in terms of their disability support staff programs. Some of it's academic, a lot of it's living, to make sure that people have the assistance they need in the situation they need to be able to do well.
So for families that are trying to figure out what makes sense for their kiddo, are there any type of transition assessments that you're able to tell us about, what types of assessments are used and how they can help create that well-informed transition plan?
Yeah, there are a lot of assessments out there, but a lot of them have value or high value only for a small amount of individuals. Because on the career side, you certainly, and again, if you go into doors on a pre-employment program, one of the things you can get is a career assessment. All right. So what they're going to do is they're going to try and figure out what you like, what you don't like, and part through testing and part through hands-on, kind of develop a profile that you are good at certain things. And it's not necessarily, they don't put you outside and say, change the tire, although they could. But it really is seeing, are you good visually? Do you recognize patterns? Can you remember things? This kind of thing. And it's, that it's meant to discover abilities, not to say, oh, you're at X grade level. It's not really what the point is. I think those can be helpful for some of the effectiveness of it gets lost with words in the air, words on a page, where, they could hands-on do a lot more than they might be able to show through a piece of paper or verbally articulating it. That's where I think that the internships that I'm talking about and through Maryland Doors and the work-based learning experiences through school, have people do some hands-on learning and, kind of see what shows through, you know, where can they show independence? Where can they show skill? Because these are clues and very important clues as to pathways that we can take advantage of and start saying, well, these kind of skills are kind of critical for these kind of jobs. I've had people, a lot of people I've had who had autism, there's a fair number who have been extremely visually capable and they can spot differences and aberrations far beyond what I could ever hope to do. And that skews towards a certain kind of job, where that's kind of a superpower. So we try to figure out, or memory, now on the one hand, just memorizing things rote is not necessarily great. But, if you're working for, I had a situation with a young man and he worked for a truck parts distributor, and he had computer skills and he had great visual memory skills. And this was the job for him. He could tell differences in anything. And literally in the first, I think it was 2 months he was there, he found them $250,000 worth of inventory they didn't know they had. Because he said, the computer's wrong. It says we have 22 of these, we have 6, or we have 48. And also, by the way, these are in the wrong spot. So we'd be buying more of these things because they got put back in the wrong spot. So, you think about these kind of background skills and how they might map into something to be very valuable.
As our young people transition to higher education or employment, what specific accommodations would that student need?
Very individual. Let's take, higher education, and I mean, there's the academic based, accommodations, which might be such as, extra time, taking your test, in a less distracting environment, could be note taking, could be a lot of different things, could be a piece of technology. On the living side in college, again, it could be, your living situation. Does that mean you're going to be better off in a single room? Does that mean you're going to be better off, really to be your best in a certain kind of living arrangement? Also plugging you into, some social pieces or, kind of a go-to facilitator for these kind of things. For the workplace, again, and this is where there's a bit of disconnect among parents too, because they'll say, well, my child was in college and he got double the time and a lighter workload. So I want that in work. And that is not a workplace accommodation to either, do half the job or do it half as fast. What you can find in the workplace is, first and foremost, you can have a job coach, and that could be done well, incredibly valuable, because that's that adjunct trainer. That's that person that connects you. That's that person that, helps you learn how's this whole system work. Beyond that, if you're an employer, sometimes will be willing to, if you're good at 7 of 8 things, sometimes they'll say, that's okay. We'll take you. You're phenomenal at 7. And the fact that number 8 is not going to work for you is okay. They don't have to do that. It's not an accommodation, but it is something that, you can kind of ask and see if it could be customized. There are any manner of technology pieces that could be used too. We have a lot of people that use kind of the simplest functions of smartwatches, and probably something we all could use. So we disable pretty much everything else on the watch, except for jobs when people need a reminder to do something. It just buzzes on their wrist and it's a text. It says, do this or remember that. Or, say if you're responsible for all the studios, responsible for 6 studios on a schedule in a gym, instead of telling you, we have people that have a hard time with functional time. They can stare at a clock until it's 10 o'clock all day. But the executive function of putting that together to say, that means I have to do X, and before that, I've got to think about getting things 10 minutes early. Well, we take the mystery out of it. So the accommodation really is to put it on the watch. And instead of telling them it's 10 o'clock, it says Studio 1. Or it says Studio 1 green towel, which happens to be maybe a microfiber. And once they're in motion with it, they press it and it goes away. So these are more common kind of accommodations that you'll see in the workplace. And again, they do differ, and that's a big kind of misconception between school and work.
And who would be the guide of that to help a family kind of come up with some strategies or help guide them as to what's available? Who is?
So if they have either Maryland Doors or Maryland DDA or both, it would be basically the people working in employment services for those agencies would be the facilitators of that. If for any reason they do not have that support, then there's always going to be either a disability services person or advocate at the place of employment. And, we certainly could speak to that person, and they're responsible for making sure they want it to work too. And, any reasonable accommodations will be provided.
As we're kind of wrapping up here, is there anything that I did not ask that I should have asked?
Oh, inevitably, yes. But, I think just to review, transition, I'm a parent and I get it. And transition is and can be absolutely positively overwhelming. It's kind of like taking that trip where you're climbing the mountain and you kept going up on the mountain, and that was either to get out of high school or get out of college. And all of a sudden you crest the mountain, and then, oh my God, beyond that is it another mountain or a series of mountains. And you thought it was all downhill from there. So again, I think start early, educate, understand, take it a piece at a time, and you can. And really understand we all want everything to happen right away, but think about your own life, career, where you learned how to maybe live on your own or how to work. And it took us time too. And it's going to take other people time. And we're interested in a career and a life path versus a snapshot that one day everything's in place, because that's not going to happen. And it didn't happen for anybody else either. So
if families have questions where to access resources or learn more about the resources in their particular state, what is your biggest suggestion for that?
Couple, there are really, for the first time, if you go to Maryland DDA, there is now a brand new guide that came out over the summer. I think it's the first one that the average person could read and not be thoroughly confused. So I think that's a big help. Again, with Maryland Doors, you can talk to your transition teacher as well. You can attend some of the meetings, and ultimately, if you immerse yourself in this and you get confused, then I'm more than happy to help people out, to really understand the particulars for their child and how it fits them.
With the Maryland DDA, does that have information on other states though?
It does not. So it is, all these services are going to be state by state.
Right.
DC has its own, Virginia has its own, but each one has companion things. So if you go to Virginia, Maryland Doors is Virginia DARS. So there's always an employment agency that is kind of a short term. And then there is a longer term support, which is a more all encompassing. And again, it would be home and community-based services over in Virginia, which has different acronyms, but it's the same. In DC, same thing. The equivalent of Maryland Doors is DC RSA, but that's Rehabilitation Services Agency, I believe. But again, that is that short-term employment piece. And then you look at the longer-term home and community-based services, which I think DC typically refers to them as waiver services. And again, there's a parallel in each place, depending upon the jurisdiction. Some of the guides are better than others. And certainly, I'll be honest about that. And I think that's part of the problem that sometimes people have, which is, I've gone to the seminar, I've tried to read this thing, and I'm not so sure.
So if I was a parent, say in Idaho, what would be your first thing to?
So there's another resource, there's a company, True North Consulting, and Eric, who really started that. He's basically tried to establish what he calls a roadmap for every state. So he's one of the few people that really is trying to give you at least some kind of a blueprint for what's available, or the universe of what's available. And that's not a bad starting point for people. Admittedly, you may look at the blueprint And that'll help you because at least it orders some things and tells you the basics. And then, of course, you're going to have a lot more questions because you say, well, okay, now I'm following the map, but I'm now at exit 2. And I got a bunch of questions on exit 2. But I think not a bad resource out of the blocks to at least see a continuum.
My final question, if you had a billboard for parents with one tip, what would it be and why?
I think it would be get educated because, knowledge is power in general. In this area, it's kind of like the tax code, right? We all go through taxes and everything else, and we look at it, or any complex piece like that, and you can get lost. It's like, I have no idea what they're talking about. But if you can get that education and knowledge, I dare say that this system actually makes sense, and you can dispel myths and really be even in situations where people have incomplete or wrong information and succeed over that.
I am grateful for your time and thank you for giving us some knowledge here on transition planning, and hopefully folks listening have some takeaways and know where to find you. And I'll also link the other agency that you had mentioned in our show notes for folks so that people know how to find you and get some answers to questions.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity in your time to speak and the opportunity as somebody who's lived this system and is living it with my sons to try to give some information. Hopefully will be helpful.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you again for tuning into another episode of the Special Ed Strategist podcast. I hope you found today's podcast insightful and valuable. Before we sign off, remember to show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our podcast. Your engagement helps us continue our mission of empowering families and bridging learning gaps in special education. Don't forget to spread the word about the Special Ed Strategist podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may benefit from our content. Together, we can make a difference in the lives of children with special needs. I am your host, Wendy Taylor, and I can't wait to bring you more inspiring content in the future. Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, and keep making a positive impact. Goodbye for now.